I'd like to welcome each one of you today to our study on the Gospel of Mark. We've been spending some time in the Gospel of Mark and seeing all kinds of good things that we can learn from in this particular book. And now today we're coming into Mark chapter 8 and verses 22 through 26. And as we come into these verses, we find that Jesus heals a blind man. And let me read those verses to you, and then we will look at them today. In Mark chapter 8 and in verse 22, it says, "And he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And he looked up, and said, I see men as trees walking. After that he put his hands upon him, again upon his eyes, and made him look up. And he was restored, and saw every man clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, Neither go into the town, nor tell it to any in the town." So as we come into these verses, there's a couple of things I want us to notice here. First of all, there is the presenting of the blind man in verse 22, where it says, "And he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him." So we see here that in these verses, Jesus arrives in Bethsaida, which is on the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee. And as Jesus arrives in that area, we see that there is a blind man that is brought to him, and there is a plea that is made. And the plea, very simply, is that Jesus would touch him. Now, obviously, the people that brought this blind man, in the touching of Jesus, in the touching of the blind man by Jesus, rather, their desire was that Jesus would heal him. And that's exactly what happens in verses 23 through 26, is the healing of the blind man. Now, it's interesting here that we notice in the first part of verse 23, it says, "He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town." Some would say, why did Jesus take him by the hand and lead him out of town? Well, there was a reason for that, and let me give you the reason for that. And we're also going to go back into the Gospel of Matthew, and we'll see a little bit more about this reason that Jesus uses for this. But the reason why Jesus did that was because Bethsaida was a community that was severely rebuked by Jesus. And Jesus brought him out of the city, and he brought him away from the unbelief that was displayed in that city in order to heal this man. Now let me read what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11 about this area of Bethsaida and some other areas there as well. In Matthew 11, verses 21 through 24, it says, "Woe unto thee, Chorazin! Woe unto thee, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon at the day of judgment than for you. And thou, Capernaum, which art exalted unto heaven, shall be brought down to hell. For if the mighty works which had been done in thee had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I say unto you, that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for thee." Now there's a number of cities that Jesus talks about and that Jesus brings a woe upon in these verses. One of those cities is this city of Bethsaida. And he says to them, woe unto them, and if the mighty works which have been done there had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, that Sodom and Gomorrah would have repented. So Jesus takes this man away from the town and away from the unbelief that is in the town, and he ministers to him outside of the town. Now notice the method that is used in verse 23. It says, "And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town, and when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught." Now that's a very unusual method. It's a very peculiar method that was used by Jesus. Some people may question, why in the world did Jesus do it this way? And other times Jesus just spoke and healed people. Why isn't it that Jesus just chose to speak here? Well, I think one of I don't fully know the answer to that, but I do know this. That you and I need to be careful that we do not question how God works in our lives. Sometimes we find ourselves in a given scenario, a given situation, and we have certain needs, and we have in our minds preconceived notions on how we want God to work or how we expect God to work, and God may work in a different way. Friends, let me encourage you, never question the working of God. Never question how God does what he does or why God does what he does. Then we see that this man sees, but he's not seeing distinctly in verse 24. He says, and he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. As I read that verse, what I see from this is that I believe that this man had not been born blind, that something had happened that had caused this man to become blind in his life. If he had been born blind, he never ever would have known what people really look like. He never would have really known what trees look like. But now in this passage, he says, I see men as trees walking. And then we see in verse 25 that Jesus completes the healing process in this man. It says, and after that he put his hands upon his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored and saw every man clearly. Yes, as we look at this, indeed it is a strange case. Jesus could have healed him immediately, but he chose not to do so. And friends, the way that God works may seem to be slow at times to us, but we must not question his working. We must not question why he is doing what he does. And now the man is healed completely. And in verse 26, Jesus says, and he sent him away to his house, saying, either go into the town or tell it to any in the town. Bethsaida had been cursed by God. They had been judged by God because they had shown their lack of faith in God. And he says, do not go back into the city. Do not testify to it about what I have done. The judgment had already been pronounced upon Bethsaida. And Jesus did no miracle there, and now he forbid a witness to be there because of the wickedness of that city. And friends, it reminds us that we need to be careful, that we do not seek to put a blessing on that which God has judged, that we do not seek to belittle that which God has judged and say, well, it's really no big deal, but that we understand that we need to walk in the full blessing of God, that we need to walk in a way that is honoring and pleasing to him, and also that we need to be careful who we fellowship with. We need to be careful of what church we attend. We need to be careful where we send converts when they're saved, because we need to understand that not everything that calls itself a church is doing the work of the Lord in the way that God is called to do. And God is giving us a very specific pattern on what we are to be doing as churches, and we need to be doing that which God has called us to do. May we seek to live our lives in accordance to what God has said in his word. And may we be very careful that we do not live our lives in such a way that God has to judge us because of the way that we're living, because of the sins that we are involved in. Oh, friends, let's seek to live our lives in such a way that the smile of God, the approval of God will be upon our lives, and that we can bring glory to his name. Have a great day.